Well, welcome everybody to today's lecture where we'll be taking a look at ancient America. The goal today is basically to look at the societies of ancient America, Mesoamerica, and South America. We'll be taking a look at the earliest civilizations, their effect on us today, and their great significance to the world as a whole. Now, remember that in this class, we ended in 1300 CE. So I don't want to disappoint all of y'all right from the beginning, but we'll be talking about the Aztecs and Incas today. That's in the second class. So if you're interested, you can enroll in World Civ 2 because they're later civilizations. They're going to be here with the arrival of the Spanish. So we won't be talking about conquistadors today or lost cities or those kinds of things. That's really more for World Civ 2. But we will be talking about the origins of those societies, basically the peoples that came before them, everything from Teotihuacan to Monte Alban, the Olmec peoples. So we'll be speaking significantly about ancient Mexican history. We'll be talking about South America as well. And the goal is just to make you more familiar with those societies and the Mayans especially too. One quick note before we begin, especially the chapter on the Mayans is being rewritten as we speak. There are discoveries that are being made in the jungles of Guatemala where they're finding entire towns that they didn't know were there before. So we might have an entirely different picture of Mayan society within the next 5 to 10 years because of new technologies. So just keep in mind, this is being recorded in 2022. So it's possible that in the future that there could be, things that we find are incorrect or things that we find are less correct than were before. So with those disclaimers, does anybody have any questions before we get started today? All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen with y'all, and we will go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing to take a look at is our timeline. So we're looking at societies that go back really about 1,000 years, 1,500 years or more. Some of them, like the Olmec culture, we will talk about as having lots of mysteries associated with them. We don't know what happens to a lot of these societies. They just kind of disappear at some point. And so that'll be a common theme with a lot of these societies, simply because there just isn't a lot of hard evidence. Much of what we have is based on the archaeological record. We don't have as much from these societies as we wish that we did. So there's a lot of question marks about what happens to them. But we'll start with some common culture, some things that are common to all Mesoamerican civilizations. And it really begins, obviously, with their origins. So first of all, we know that humans probably started migrating into North America sometime between about 12,000 to 30,000 years ago. At that time, the ocean levels were lower. And because of that, the Bering Strait, which is separating Alaska from Russia today, that at one time probably was a river shallows where people could cross, and they did. So it's more than likely true that the peoples who comprise Native Americans have their ancestry in Asia, particularly in Northeastern Asia. And those people would have followed game at that time during the Mesolithic era, and they would have crossed over and eventually ended up stranded in the Americas when the ocean levels began to rise. So there was a global warming, right?
The ice connect to the Wi-Fi network. You might want to check the connection settings in the Google Home app.
Interesting. Well, Google is very much engaged today. But basically, we know that 11,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, the ocean levels began to rise. And because of that, what happened was it stranded those people on the other side. So people that had once been Asians now became Native Americans because they're going to be separated by that land bridge, which now is going to be water. So that probably is the origin story of most of the first Native Americans. Now, for them, when they crossed over, they're going to cross over during a period where they're going to have, mammoths, and, it's basically as we get to the end of the ice age. So as those animals began to die off, they had to figure out how to survive, just like we talked about in other parts of the class. You guys are on guard. We got our guard dogs here barking at the mailman. Right. But basically what happens is we have basically a society that's forced to change. These people originally were hunter-gatherers, and now they're going to have to transition to agriculture, which they begin to do probably somewhere, around 3000-ish, 2000 BCE. And this is where we begin to see the first wild crops that end up being cultivated. The one that's probably we're most familiar with is what we would call maize. Now, maize obviously is called corn. Corn technically is a term for any kind of grain. So the Romans called it barley corn or wheat corn, but it's technically we refer to it as maize, corn, whatever. But we know what we're talking about, right? So the original corn is tiny. It's like this big. So when you go to like an Asian restaurant and you end up ordering like the little mini corn cobs, and you almost feel bad. You don't want to eat them because they're like so tiny. It's like a little corn kid. Well, those were what the original corn was sized as. They were about that size. So that was basically what people were eating. Now, of course, over time, through genetic modification, people started to breed them. They started to eventually create bigger plants with larger bounties. And of course, you've got, your corn in a cup and your elote and all the things that you're familiar with today. But basically at this time, the peoples began to cultivate crops. Corn was one of the first ones. We also have beans and squash, all of which are going to constitute what's known as the Three Sisters technique. Hey guys, guys, it's the mailman. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Right. So basically the Three Sisters technique, as it's referred to, right? Calm down, Jesse. Calm down, Jesse. Yes, calm down. It's okay. She's just delivering packages. Right? Just delivering packages. All right. So we three sisters, you got corn, beans, and squash. All three of them basically were planted together. And the reason for that was because you would end up getting, essentially the best of all three. This is what we would call crop rotation. So what they would do, and this was way ahead of what Europeans were doing at the time, because remember, they're using the strip field system where one in every 3 or 4 fields is just left fallow to recover its fertility. So, like 30% of your fields just aren't doing anything. Whereas with them, they're still growing crops, they're still productive, and they're still recovering the soil's fertility. So what they would do is you would grow corn, which is tall, blocks out the weeds. It grows faster than the weeds, actually. And then you've got, that's good for the beans because beans don't grow fast enough to compete with the weeds. But the beans obviously put nutrients back into the soil, which the corn needs, right? And then lastly, you've got the squash. And the good thing about squash is if you've ever grown it, it just kind of sprawls out everywhere. And so the advantage of squash is that it goes all over the place. And so it can be tethered to climb up the corn stalks or just spread out where it becomes kind of a mulch. So that's what they were doing in the Americas. And this was a very highly productive system of agriculture. So the peoples that did this were able to record massive populations. Places like, for example, Mayan cities and Aztec cities and Inca cities are going to have, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of people in some cases. And that's largely because they had such an excellent agricultural system. And one of the things that I want to play up, at least in today's lecture, is to talk about the fact that Mesoamerican peoples were highly advanced peoples. They had a highly advanced system of government. They had highly advanced agriculture. Their architecture was excellent, right? The only thing where they were slightly deficient was essentially in military technology as compared to the peoples they were fighting, the Europeans. The other thing, of course, is disease. And that's something that, ultimately was a trump card for Europeans. You just couldn't anticipate that these guys would have these super weapons like this. And they did. And disease is going to wipe out most of the native populations, not swords or guns. But ultimately, when it comes to understanding the culture and its merits, there are many. So when the Europeans showed up, especially Bernal Diaz riding around with Cortez, they saw things they'd never seen before. They saw towns that were much larger than anything they would have saw in Europe. So it's not to say that they were a primitive culture, because they were in many ways more advanced than the peoples who came in and replaced them. Other peoples had better military technology, and of course they were immune to diseases. So all of those, I think, play a role in the early stages. We have obviously large areas. We have large empires like the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas. As you get into North America and the United States and that area and Canada, you didn't really have huge cities. You had Cahokia, which is the one example that is a little bit different. It's the one outlier. We don't really know how big it actually was. Probably 100,000, maybe 50,000 to 100,000 people. But mostly in the Americas, you didn't see, those kinds of things. There was more spread out. In fact, the best understanding we have of the amount of native peoples when Columbus shows up is like 60 million, 48 million, some say 90. I usually just split the middle and say 60. So that's in the entire continents of both North and South America. And just to understand, the population of the United States today is over 300 million just by itself. So you get an idea of how kind of sparsely inhabited these places were. So that kind of gives a role in the development of these societies as well. Other problems the societies would experience, they never developed writing systems, at least the Andean ones. The Andean civilizations didn't have writing. The Incas obviously used quipu, knotted strings to record things. Mesoamericans did have writing. They had essentially a pictograph system. The Mayans had that. And we do understand a degree of it. So we know what the Mayans were trying to say about their past, but there were other societies that wrote in other systems that we don't know. And that's somewhat of a problem. We also don't have a lot of source available because when the Spanish came in and conquered things, they were very aware that native cultures needed to be destroyed in order to preserve their own. So they very quickly started converting the population to Christianity. They very quickly started bringing in Spanish customs, language, and law, and replaced what the previous Indian systems were there if they weren't already gone. So that's a problem as well. We don't have as much source information as we want. And a lot of native sources were probably destroyed because they were deemed heretical by 16th century religious practices. So there's a lot of things, misnomers as far as names like Indian. We refer to people as Indians, but this is essentially a misnomer because, as we know, the people of the Americas weren't Indians, weren't even related to Indians. So there's issues with that as well as far as terminology and etymology of where we get certain names from. And of course, most of our perspective is the Eurocentric perspective, right? Because most of us are European or have European ancestry. So typically the winners are going to write history. And in this case, that's certainly true of Native American history. So we probably have a flawed understanding of many of these societies. And so it's our hope as historians and archaeologists that we can move forward and try to get a better understanding, right, as the years go by. And certainly these new discoveries in Guatemala, those are heartening. Those are something that hopefully can rewrite the history books and make things a little bit easier for us to understand. Any questions as far as the development of Mesoamerican societies? Okay, so other common aspects of these societies, they had pottery by 3000 BCE. We know that most of them cultivated corn. We know that they had domesticated animals, turkey, dogs, llamas, right? We're all a part of that. The one problem is that all of these are not animals that you're going to use as beasts of burden to carry really heavy things. Llamas, although they are reliable companions in the mountains, they're not going to be able to carry huge stone blocks, nor would you want to do so unless you're a really, bad llama parent. So ultimately, the animals that they had were tiny. They weren't capable of carrying large loads. So when you look at Machu Picchu, for example, which was constructed on a vertical mountainside, that basically was constructed by people. People picked up rocks and carried them up the mountain. So if you think you've had a bad day because you had to go out in the heat for 15 minutes, imagine these guys who had to do it all the time. So at that time, labor was very cheap. And so a lot of the constructions took place in that fashion. They also did not have the wheel, so carts were not a possibility. Where we talk about Egypt, we also talk about Sumer as having the wheel to transport wagons and chariots. You're not going to see that in Mesoamerica. That just doesn't happen. So with no wheel, they're limited as to the amount of heaviness that they're going to be able to carry. Now, as far as advanced structures, they did have writing. Most of the societies had either a pictographic system or something else. They had calendars that were some of the most accurate in the world, especially the Mayan ones. And they had shared sports. So we know that they were polytheistic societies who worshiped multiple gods. And we know in particular that there are some shared traits, one of the biggest ones being the sport that we refer to as the ball game. So by 1700 BCE, there's evidence that the Olmec probably invented it, and then it was something that just was around for years. The ball game, as it was referred to, essentially is one of 1,500 different courts that have been found all over Mesoamerica. And the Spanish even record watching some of these take place. And so that's really where we understand how it functioned. Basically, what it was there was like a huge, like, you'd have like a ball court here that was shaped like an eye. And then what you would have is the people would sit here and watch, and then they would obviously play in the middle. And then there was a hoop of sorts at each end. And the goal was ultimately to try to take a leather-ish ball and try to knock it into the hoop, kind of like basketball, but you couldn't use your hands. So it was kind of a mix of soccer and basketball together, right? So this sport was played quite significantly throughout Mesoamerica and was extraordinarily popular because we find these ball courts everywhere. And so we have some issues with some of the sources. One of the Spanish sources talked about the fact that the team that won would be revered and the team that lost would be sacrificed. Obviously, I would assume that, if Dak Prescott probably would throw less interceptions if he knew he was going to get sacrificed at the end of the season, right? So I don't know if this was for athletic performance or just a cultural aspect. I doubt that they would sacrifice an entire team, especially one that was really skilled, right? But that might have been a practice that happened at one time ish. But yeah, I don't know many people who want to sign up to be an athlete, knowing that the one time that you lose, you're not going to survive. So that's what happened in these Mesoamerican games, as far as we understand. So there's some problems with understanding that. Women did play the game as well. It was hard to delineate whether they were women or men because they would wear headgear. And so the one difference, obviously, between the women playing the game and the men was that the women would wear like leather padding on their shoulders and heads, like helmets. Men did not. So for reasons that we don't know, I guess because men have harder heads. Yes, because we're so stubborn. Maybe they weren't as afraid, or maybe because men were easily sacrificable. I don't know. We don't know why you see women with protective clothing but men do not, but that's one difference between the two. But it was a game that was played by both sexes regardless. Now, before we get into the first civilizations, does anybody have any questions as far as ball game, as far as the culture of Mesoamerica? One of the questions asked, were there trades between teams? I don't know. We honestly don't know. We don't really know anything about the logistics of how the game was played. It's all based on what other people saw. So I would assume that there would be a probably, there probably would be players that were well respected. They probably, some things of modern sports would translate over into that. I don't know how much, but that one I can't answer. We simply don't know. We don't know enough about it to know whether trading took place or whether there were club teams or any of those kinds of things. But there are some things about it. If it's that popular, probably those are things that will develop naturally over time. It happened in Rome. It happened in Greece. It happened in a lot of places. So it might have happened in Mesoamerica. Other questions? All right, so the first major society we're going to take a look at is that of the Olmecs, right? The Olmec is one of the ones that most people remember, especially if you're in your 30s or so, because there was an old school Nickelodeon game show called Legends of the Hidden Temple. And it had like a Mesoamerican theme at the beginning. And then basically the mascot was this big stone thing that would talk to you, and his name was Olmec. Well, that's how I always remember the Olmec, because when I was a kid, I used to watch that show. It wasn't great, but it was something, right? Certainly, it was in an era where you had like game shows where people actually had to perform like athletic feats, as opposed to today where it's very different. But as far as the Olmec, they were peoples that built giant stone heads, kind of like the Easter Island heads. Some of these were massive. They could be up to 20 tons. And how they were able to transport them, we don't know. The holy sites of the Olmecs were scattered throughout, and some of the distances between where these places would have been mined and where the heads were supposed to go were 60, 70 miles. So how these guys transport a 20-ton stone head 60 miles, I have absolutely no idea. And the other thing is that when you build the Suez Canal, for example, in Egypt, I mean, it's a feat, but Egypt's mostly flat. If you've been to Mexico, it's not flat. There's not a lot of parts of it that are. So even though these guys are on the Gulf Coast, which is flatter than most, right, they're going to have to deal with a lot of terrain challenges, rainforests, mountains, hills, those kinds of things. And the fact that they were able to transport those, it shows that they had some pretty sophisticated engineering and willing participants. The other aspect about the Olmec was they probably began occupying settlements as early as 1500 BCE, as we talked about earlier, along the Gulf Coast of Mexico on the eastern side. So, I mean, they might have been there before, but the best evidence we have is that they began, inhabiting these areas about 1615, 1400 BCE. They even built large pyramids. So much of what the Olmecs do is they're kind of like the Egyptians, that they're a predecessor. They're kind of going to lay the foundations for what other cultures will eventually build upon. And I think that's their real significance, in addition to the fact that they produce these massive stone heads. We know that there were figures like the jaguar that became synonymous with animal worship. Those are things that would happen in other cultures as well. But by 400 BCE, they're gone. The sites are mostly gone. And we don't really know why. It could be volcanism, potentially, that volcanoes in that area, which are active. It could be that they were invaded and taken over by somebody else. It could be that they migrated someplace else because of some kind of issue, climate change, drying out, whatever. But unfortunately, we just don't know a lot about the Olmec. We know some aspects of them, and then they disappear by about 400 BCE. Now, the next society is Monte Alban, and that culture rises to prominence really a little bit after the Olmec. They're going to build a fairly large city at Monte Alban, and it will probably have at its peak about 20,000 people, conservatively. We know that they had warriors. We know that they built armies of sorts, because we've seen that as far as their archaeological records. And we know that they had a 365-day solar calendar and a 260-day one. They had two calendars. So obviously the building of a calendar is probably their most significant feature as a society. This is the primary calendar that most ancient American societies are going to use. And the Mayans, of course, are going to take it and refine it to make it into something that is quite special. So very interesting to see that we have societies, even as early as 600 BCE, that have a 365-day calendar, something that was not in use in Europe until really the Middle Ages. So here you've got your colossal heads. This is an example of one of the Olmec statues. And here you can see some of the Mesoamerican sites on display as far as where many of these have been created. So again, along the eastern coast of Mexico, as you can see here, Monte Alban, of course, is in the mountains. So you can see the differences between the sites and why they're important. Now, let's take a look at the next society, which is Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is a site which is a huge tourist draw even today in Mexico City. Originally, it was built separate from Mexico City, but Mexico City has grown so much in the last 10, 20 years that it's become what's called a megalopolis. That is essentially a city that encompasses much of the areas that are around it. And so because of this, now Teotihuacan is actually now a suburb of Mexico City. It's right on the edge. And so Teotihuacan at one point was a city that began to develop because of its merchant connections. It was right in the middle of the obsidian trade. Everybody knows what obsidian is, yes? Obsidian? It's a kind of stone. Yeah, it is. It's a volcanic glass, basically. It's made by volcanism. And so it's basically like a glass of sorts. And what that does is it produces a very hard edge. So you can imagine if you've ever stepped on glass, or if you're familiar with how sharp it can get, obsidian is one of the sharpest substances known to man. So the peoples who lived here were trading obsidian, and they probably made quite a substantial amount of money in the process. And that's what allowed Teotihuacan to thrive as basically a merchant center. It was right in the middle of multiple trade routes, obsidian, jade, crops, all of those were going to go through Teotihuacan. So obviously Teotihuacan has a tremendous importance because one of their rivals that had kept them down for years was destroyed by a volcano. Maybe this was Monte Alban, maybe it was somebody else, right? We don't really know, but we do know that by about 100 BCE or so that they begin to kind of come into their own as a city. And really by about the 200s, 300 CE, right, while the Roman Empire is starting to fall, they had some of the largest cities in the world. Teotihuacan had about 150,000, 200,000 people in it, which, although it wasn't as big as ancient Rome in its heyday, by 200, 300 CE, ancient Rome isn't in its heyday anymore. So Teotihuacan was probably the largest and most powerful city in the world at its time, right? Other aspects of the city that show its dominance, it had fertile farmlands. It had, as we talked about, the trade routes. It had built an enormous series of pyramids, right? The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, right, within the city itself. It had temples in the central district. It was laid out on a north-south axis, right? So you literally had avenues that would run north, south, and east and west, which is something you don't see a lot of, at least not in the ancient world, right? It's a level of engineering that is tremendous, much better than what we saw in the medieval period. And so you had an orderly city. It was very well laid out, very logical. These huge religious pyramids, and maybe you've got a chance to go to the Temple of the Sun or Temple of the Moon. And if you did, you can see, of course, that they're quite large on the outskirts of the city. This is the Temple district. So you can see, of course, the central riser. You can see, obviously, the temples that surround it. And then, of course, you would have had residential neighborhoods that would have surrounded the city all the way up to the pyramids, right? The Pyramid of the Sun, right? You can see, obviously, people walking on it to give you a sense of scale. Maybe some of you have had a chance to visit it or have been there. I don't know if you can still climb it anymore. I know that you could as of like 10 years ago. But whether you do or not, those of you who go to Mexico, you can report back with your evidence. But as far as the Pyramid of the Sun, it is quite large. Now, obviously, this is where I get into the discussion, as we talked about with ancient Egypt, where students inevitably bring up the concept of aliens. If the Egyptians have pyramids and the peoples in South America have pyramids, then it's obvious that aliens were revealing these technologies to people. Yes. Well, that is one, I guess, possibility, even though it's way out there. I would essentially say that people are definitely bright enough to be able to figure out engineering ideas. And as we talked about with ancient Egypt, if you want to build a large stone structure that reaches towards the heavens and you don't have steel as a lattice work, then you're kind of limited on your options. So more than likely what you had was a wide base that goes into a narrow top, right? Simply because it's going to diffuse the weight of the structure across the entire structure and into the ground. So what are you going to build? You're going to build a pyramid. It's your only real logical alternative to build a large lasting structure. And so as you can see here, that's what they've got essentially is a pyramid, right? Did the predator come down from his spaceship and show them how to do it so he can make a hunting ground? Possibly, if that's the movie that you want to believe. But as far as humans, yeah, they are capable of stacking blocks. All of y'all did it in kindergarten, right? People here could do it as well, right? Engineers could figure out the math behind it, the geometry to make it work. So Pyramid of the Sun, probably not an alien invention. More than likely, it was built by humans. Now, what happens to Teotihuacan? Teotihuacan, for reasons that we don't know, ends up being destroyed by fire, probably around 500 CE. Was that fire set intentionally? Was it accidental? Right? Certainly, it could be either one. The other thing to understand is that there were internal uprisings taking place at this time because much of the city is destroyed and abandoned by the 7th and 8th centuries. So something happened. It might have been that taxes were too high and people went nuts, or it could be that they were invaded by somebody else, which is also likely. Being at the center of an important trade, they're going to be wealthy, and that's going to make them a target. So any of these could be possibilities. We don't really know what happens to Teotihuacan, but we know by the 7th and 8th centuries, it is gone completely. The significance of Teotihuacan is not only that it was a massive city that controlled the trade throughout Mesoamerica, but also that many of the Teotihuacan traditions like Quetzalcoatl, right, the origins of life, much of what the Aztecs believe is based off of Teotihuacan. And so they are in many ways kind of the progenitors of the Aztec culture. The Aztecs even look at Teotihuacan as like the founding of the world. To them, that was the beginning of history as they knew it. So all of these play a major role as far as how Teotihuacan will be a bedrock that other societies will eventually base themselves off of. So any questions as far as Teotihuacan is concerned? Question is, did the Aztecs and Teotihuacan have any contact with each other? Probably not. Aztecs would have come in hundreds of years after Teotihuacan was already gone. Earliest records date the Aztecs coming in about 1200. So you're looking at about 500 years that separates Teotihuacan from the Aztecs. Now, they certainly could have seen the ruins, and that probably would have been inspiration for them. And certainly they would have, heard from nearby peoples that had dealt with Teotihuacan, maybe some of which used to live there, right, that were forced to abandon the site for whatever reason. But ultimately, yeah, the Aztecs are inspired by Teotihuacan, I think is the best term to use. Other questions? Okay. All right, so the Mayans. The Mayans are going to take up probably most of our time today. They are a big civilization that has tremendous significance as far as our societies are concerned today. Mayan peoples originally would have inhabited the areas of southern Mexico, Guatemala, and northern Central America. The earliest sites that we found are around 800 BCE, but some of the sites they're finding today in the rainforest are even before that. So we're rewriting the books as we speak. But by the late classic period, the Mayans were constructing large temples, they had large cities, and even today, Mayan inscriptions are still something that historians and treasure hunters, kind of guess at what they were trying to understand. The Mayans were a extraordinarily important people. Number one, because politically they were city-states, just like we talked about with ancient Greece. There was no Mayan country. Mayans were a group of city-states that had a common culture, common gods, and common ideas, and spoke a common language. The issue was that they didn't necessarily get along, just like the Greeks did. So there was a lot of infighting between them. The city of Tikal probably was one of the largest Mayan sites that we found, although some sites in Guatemala might change that. 70,000, 80,000 people probably lived in Tikal. Most of the cities politically were dominated by a priestly elite. So kind of like ancient Sumer in the respect that you had city states, but you also had priests that ruled over them. Warfare was probably regular. We know that Mayan states would not only fight outside states, but also fight amongst themselves pretty regularly. And ultimately, the Mayans believed in a calendar that was based off of the one at Monte Alban. This one ultimately believed in what's called the long count, or a series of cycles that would take place. The most recent of these cycles ended in 2012. So if you remember the whole 2012 thing, there was a really shitty movie that came out. There was other things that were associated with it. That was basically part of this concept, right? The 2012, because it was the end of one of these long counts, these 52, 54-year cycles. And at the end of these, there's usually some kind of apocalyptic phenomenon. As the cycle ends, something happens that brings about a new cycle. And just like in a forest, the forest grows and then it gets old and dry, and then lightning strikes it and it catches fire, or somebody doesn't put their campfire out and it ends up burning up the forest, and that's what helps to renew it. Well, in this instance, that's what the Mayans believe, that something will purge the world and then essentially a new world will emerge after it, that hopefully will be better than the previous one. And that's basically what these long counts were about. Now, obviously, if you lived through 2012, I don't think anything significantly big happened. I guess One Direction. So I guess they could be about as apocalyptic as it can possibly get. But the Temple of Tikal, this is an example of a ruler's tomb, and particularly the Jaguar Paw line, which ruled over Tikal for centuries, basically a dynasty of individuals that were connected to each other. And then other aspects of Mayan society, jade. The jade trade was alive and well, jade being a green stone that is made into a variety of different things, from jewelry to masks, in this case, a funeral mask. And you can see, of course, ear piercings. You can see, of course, headdresses, other things that were made out of it as well. So it was extraordinarily valuable to the Mayans. Pictographic writing, the Mayans essentially had pictures that would represent certain sounds, similar to what the Egyptians had. And so by doing so, you could, decipher what they were talking about. We have an understanding of that because there are still Mayans that live. If you go to Mexico, especially southern Mexico, there are still Mayan peoples that live there. So as far as the language, it is still spoken. As far as the pictographs, we still have people that understand them. So as far as the Mayans, we probably know more about them than we know about most other Mesoamerican societies that just kind of vanish. Now, also obviously talking about the positive things, their astronomy was outstanding. Their architecture was outstanding. They build these, structures like a Tikal that have these, curvature and lines that you would not have seen in European buildings that were just really boxy at this time. They had the abilities to build out of stone. If you go, for example, to Machu Picchu, which I know is an Incan site, but they were able to construct this temple without using any mortar. So they basically probably took the stones and they chiseled them out in the shapes that they wanted them and then fit them together like Lego blocks individually. And even to this day, if you go to Machu Picchu, you can't even get a credit card in between some of the stones. That's how well suited they are. Will TSE be here in 2,000 years? Maybe. Some halls I think are better built than others, but probably not. And so even our modern techniques today aren't going to compare with how they were able to build things, and it's some of them on vertical mountains. So again, they're not Mayans, but you get the idea. The Mayans built their own temples. They had their own structures and cities that even today are being found in rainforests, which are some of the most hostile climates to buildings and to organic matter that you can think of as far as decaying stuff. So all of those are a part of how the Mayans have had an influence on us. They had the zero, they had advanced medicines. We know that they had healing. They used various herbs for healing practices that would be used later by the Spaniards and, of course, even us today. So all of those are a big part of what they do. Now, with the good comes the bad. Certainly, the Mayans also did things that probably were not going to be so happy about, like human sacrificing. So human sacrificing wasn't just done willy-nilly. It did have a legitimate purpose in Mayan society. So if you go to Mayan mythology, for example, the Mayans were polytheistic and they worshiped multiple gods. In particular, they worshiped two twins called the hero twins. And in the story, the hero twins basically end up sacrificing themselves to save the rest of the world. So although this is something that's very common in video games, it's common in movies, miniseries and stuff even today, it was popular in Mayan society too. So what would happen is people who were being sacrificed were commemorating what the hero twins had done. And through the spilling of blood, you were guaranteeing that the sun would come up the next day. Now, does that mean that, like the Aztecs who sacrificed 50,000 people in a single day, does that mean you're good for 50,000 days? I don't know. That's something to talk to somebody who's more qualified as far as Aztec history. But as far as the Mayans, yeah, their belief was that people needed to be sacrificed in order for the blessings of the gods to continue. Mayan gods were vengeful gods. And if they didn't get their daily doses of sacrificing, then they were surely going to curse you. And you didn't want that to happen because terrible, awful shit would happen to you. So what would happen is, let's say originally in the early stages, that people would actually volunteer for this, knowing that their family members would be taken care of by the state for the rest of their life. The problem is that much like all of y'all out there, if I was to tell you that if you sacrificed yourself, you would save the world, how many of you right now would sacrifice yourself? Any volunteers? Not a single person has volunteered. So there's your problem. There was not a large pool of willing sacrificial victims. So what ends up happening instead is you end up getting, you know, a drying out of the sacrificial victim pool. So now you got to go out and find them. So they started taking captives from war, where many other societies would take captives in order to enslave them. The Mayans would take them in order to kill them. And so you would, let's say that you're some small village, right? That's a question. Like Apocalypto. Yeah, just like Apocalypto. Now, Apocalypto isn't the most historically accurate movie. It has a lot of issues, but it covers an era that isn't covered very often, which is Mayans. And they are Mayans, at least they're supposed to be. So you can imagine, like in the movie, you're some neighboring tribe somewhere and you live in the jungle and the Mayans come for you and they're much more powerful and they defeat you guys in battle. That means that the people who are left are going to essentially become sacrificial victims, right? And they would use their weapons in a less than lethal mode, which we'll talk about here in just a second. And they would basically drag you out, kidnap you. They would take you up to the temple where the sacrifices would be conducted. You would be painted blue, which was the color of the gods. Then you would be led up to the top of the temple steps where there would be a priest who would say to you, warrior, willing and unafraid, do you sacrifice yourself to God X? And your response would be, it doesn't matter whether you don't want it. It's a rhetorical question. They're going to kill you anyway. So 4 really big guys are going to hold you down on a stone slab. At that point, a priest is going to pull out an obsidian dagger, obsidian, of course, being volcanic glass, very good, very sharp. And then he's going to basically hold it up to the heavens. And then in one fell swoop, he's going to bring it down, crush your breastbone, and cut your heart out while you're still alive. The last thing that you're going to see as you're writhing in agony is essentially your heart squirting blood all over the place. And that's basically you dead. That's how you're going to die. They'll then take the heart, right, and they'll take it over to another priest who is standing by the statue of a god, interpreting the god's will, and then they will squeeze it. They'll milk the heart and cover that entire statue with blood. And the goal of that is essentially so that you're bathing the god in blood. The god is supposedly in that statue. And then the person who's next to it, the priest or priestess who's there, she has been essentially inhaling volcanic gases, right, for the last couple of hours. So she is definitely high as shit, or he is high as shit. And at that point, he's going to speak for the god. And if he determines that the god is satisfied, then the sacrifices stop. If he doesn't, then they continue. And they keep going until eventually the god's thirst is sated or they run out of victims, one or the other. Now, if like in the movie, if a eclipse happens or something astronomically takes place, then that might be interpreted as the will of the god as well. But once it's done, then at that point, you know, essentially the god has been satiated, and for the most part, the sacrifice has done its job, and that's basically what its purpose is. Okay, so the question says, well, what do they do with the body after they're done with it? It's a very good question because it's the next part. The next part is to take a look at, all right, well, now what do they do with your corpse? What they would typically do is they would cut it into multiple pieces, and then they would proceed to throw it down the temple steps. So one of the things to understand about the idea of Mayan temples is if you go to Chichen Itza, which is a Mayan temple, by the way, one of the best preserved in the world, right? If you walk up the steps, one of the things you'll notice is that the steps are really tiny. And so you might think to yourself, oh, the Mayans were really tiny people. Not true. In fact, the Spanish talked about the Mayans as being even taller than the Spanish were. So it wasn't an issue of being too tiny. The reason those steps are so small, you got it, is so that body parts don't get stuck on them. They're going to throw the body parts off the top, and they don't want them to get stuck because then some priest is going to have to walk up and down and clear them out. You know, you don't want some guys, you know, arm to get stuck halfway, you know, down the thing, and then you got to go and clear it. So they would literally throw the body parts off, and then people would gather probably in large crowds at the bottom, and then they would basically fight over who gets the body parts. Kind of like, you know, people fight over who gets the guitar pick at the end of an Aerosmith concert, right? Well, that's basically what people would do at Chichen Itza. Now, you might say to yourself, why the hell would anybody care about getting disembodied limbs? Well, because the disembodied limbs, supposedly because of the human sacrifice, have the essence of a god within them. So you're basically looking at something that's going to bring you good luck in the future. It's going to bring you fortune. It's going to bring you superpowers. You're going to have the essence of a god inside of you, right? It's almost like the Harry Potter movie where he takes liquid luck, right? That's what's going to happen to you. So you're going to take it home as soon as you get an opportunity, and you're going to invite over all the people that you like, and you're going to have a feast, and all of you are going to eat that body part, right? The more people you like, the better. And everybody that gets a piece of that, whatever it was, that those people are all going to be blessed by luck, supposedly, and have the power of a god within them for a limited amount of time. Like wearing a rabbit's foot or any of the other superstitious stuff, like buildings not having a 13. Those are all examples of things that we do in the modern era as well. So we're not, we're not separate from superstition, but for them, that was their idea. Now, this does present problems. The Mayans didn't practice cannibalism on a large scale. They simply did it for a religious reason. So imagine that you are a Spaniard who's a devout Catholic, right? Maybe most of y'all are not, but imagine like your parents or imagine like your grandparents, right, who came over from Mexico, are really Catholic, like super Catholic, like next level Catholic. And imagine, the veneration that Catholics have for life. And now you as a Spaniard are walking through, one of these Mayan territories or cities, and you see this kind of shit going on. What are you going to think? What's your grandma going to say when she sees people getting their hearts ripped out? People eating body parts? Yeah, she's be pretty upset. I think she's going to be a tad upset about that. Yeah. So the Spaniards, being devout Catholics, saw it as their duty to slay these heathens. They thought that this was essentially the closest to Satan that they're going to get. These guys are obviously powered by some kind of dark force. So it's our job to make sure that, they end up, meeting their maker, to stand trial for their crimes. They weren't really about understanding someone's culture. And I think that even today, in an era like today, where we think that we're better at understanding people's cultures, seeing this, it would definitely send a shiver down your spine. It's like watching Saw 500. I don't think a lot of people are going to be able to stand it. So human sacrifice kind of alienated the natives to the Spaniards, and it gave them a justification to kill them. Not that they needed any, but now they definitely aren't going to lose any sleep about it, because they think that what they're doing is a holy act. And remember, Spaniards grew up in a climate where they fought the Reconquista. So to them, one heathen looks the same as the other, right? And so to them, they didn't have a problem with that. Most of them probably. So hopefully it answers your question as far as where the body parts go and the justification for what happens. The other problem is, what is the easiest way to spread smallpox? Direct physical contact. And I can't think of anything that's more direct and physical than putting something in your mouth. And so obviously the peoples that sacrifice Spaniards, for example, at La Noche Triste with the Aztecs, or the battles that the Pueblo won, or some of the battles with the Aztec or the Mayans, people got wiped out. When the diseases started, they just killed off millions of people because they had no way to be able to fight back. Curiously, the reason this happens is, remember we talked about the land bridge and people crossing over from Asia? When they did that, it was during the Ice Age. So it's the same reason why y'all have freezers and refrigerators. What do? Why do you have a refrigerator or a freezer in your house? To keep food fresh, right? It's not going to keep it fresh forever, because you got freezer burn. And certainly when it comes to the fridge, I mean, even if you've got meat in there, you got a couple of days, but it's longer than it just sitting at room temperature, where it's going to start to spoil almost immediately. That's the point. It delays the growth of bacteria. So these people were infested with all kinds of diseases. And when they crossed over, because they got refrigerated, those diseases were slowed down so that when the next generation got them, they didn't have them. The next couple of generations simply didn't have yellow fever or typhus or those kinds of things. I mean, they definitely did have diseases in the Americas, but not nearly the same amount. The diphtherias and the scarlet fevers and all of those things that are going to come over from Europe, and especially smallpox, which is the deadliest of all of them by far. So they kind of refrigerated themselves, and that's what kind of led to them not having the same immunity that Europeans had. Europeans went through the school of hard knocks. They lived because they They were either immune to it or they could live with it and it wouldn't necessarily kill them. They developed that over centuries. The Aztecs, Incas, Mayans, they didn't have that. So they just got wiped out. Questions on human sacrifice and its legacies? I know we talked a lot about it, but I get a lot of questions on human sacrifice. I just want to make sure that all of them are answered. Good? Okay. All right, Mayan warfare. So as talked about before, the Mayans did engage in a variety of different kinds of wars. They fought really two kinds of wars. The wars that we're familiar with, which involves them trying to destroy their neighbors. And the second kind of war, which were called flower wars. This is a term the Aztecs gave it, but certainly the Mayans would have probably participated in them as well. Flower wars, although you might think, oh man, people throwing flower petals at each other, that doesn't sound too bad. No, basically these were wars that were fought with less than lethal weapons. So they would take, for example, the arrowheads off of their arrows. They would take the blades out of their clubs, right? And the goal was ultimately to take as many captives as possible. So in a flower war, you're trying to get captives. You're not necessarily trying to destroy the other side, although they might end up going hand in hand. So they had weapons that could be made, I guess, less than lethal, although it's, still giving somebody a concussion by whacking them with a club, there's still a chance that they could get a brain bleed and die. So it wasn't a foolproof thing. But basically the goal was to try to get as many captives as they could, because that's how warriors would rank up. Mayans used a variety of different kinds of weapons. They used a club that had blades in it called a macahuitl, which was kind of like a sword / club with obsidian blades. They had spears. They had what was called an addle, which is kind of a dart thrower, basically a wooden structure that you would fling darts long distances at people. They had bows and arrows, which they would use quite extensively. Shields were used, and they did have armor. Now, that being said, they're not going to use steel armor. They're going to be using cotton armor. So it's going to be like wearing a pillow. Obviously, against concussive wounds, it's going to protect you pretty well. Against something that's sharp, right? You can go, try to stab your pillow and see what happens. It's not going to do a lot of good. And that's the problem, is their armor was not great against sharp stuff, especially the weapons that the Europeans are carrying, which are going to be made out of steel, whether they be swords, whether they be spears, halberds, crossbows, etc. It ain't going to do a whole lot of good to wear a pillow against that kind of stuff. So that's what they're going to be using as far as their armor and their weapons when they fight wars. We already talked about mathematics and astronomy being advanced. We talked about their political aspects. 800 CE, the fall of the Mayans. So Mayan civilization basically comes to an end, very mysterious end. But actually, the interesting thing about the Mayans is that they don't end completely. They have a second period that happens later. So the early period is called the classical period. And by the 800 CE, the long count dates stop. Most of the sites are abandoned and they're just basically gone. Now, remember, the first period of Mayan civilization was in the Guatemalan jungle, and it goes away. So they now end up shifting to the Yucatan and southern Mexico, where Mayan civilization continues. Probably people that fled from whatever apocalypse took place down there, and then they set up shop in Mexico, where they would be there when the Spaniards arrived, and that's eventually what leads to their conquests. But basically, the Mayans had to pick up and leave. Now, why did they do this? Again, we don't know, but there are a variety of hypotheses. We know from some of the sites that have been found in the rainforest that soil exhaustion, overpopulation probably played a role. We know the Mayans were always fighting, so it's very likely that they, ended up destroying each other, and the fighting is going to lead to crop shortages, which is going to lead to mass famines. The last aspect is essentially labor shortages, possibly due to sacrifices, but also war. And then finally, monumental building. They built huge monuments. Much like the Egyptians, they might have, bit off more than they could chew, and as a result, ended up bankrupting the state. And then possibly the elites lose their authority and the peasants revolt. These are possibilities. We don't know exactly what happens, but we do know that there are Mayans around when the Spanish show up. And even today, there are Mayans who still live in southern Mexico. So these are the two different periods of Mayan society and the differences between the two. Any questions on the Mayans and their significance? Okay. All right, the next group of people is the Toltecs. The Toltecs were a group of people that the Mayans called barbaric. Now, obviously, when we look at what the Mayans were doing, right, they're doing this kind of shit. So to call somebody barbaric, they're probably pretty barbaric. Yeah, somebody who's, if a mass murderer comes to you and says, "You're fucked up, man," probably there's something wrong with you. So when it comes to the Toltecs, that's one of the things that we see. They're a barbaric people by Mayan standards. We know that many future societies like the Aztecs and others would base themselves off of the Toltecs as well. The Toltecs were a military people. They essentially were kind of thugs in that they would come in and they would take people over and they would force you to pay a tribute payment. And that tribute payment usually would increase each year. It was a kind of it was kind of a ransom. And if you didn't pay it, they would come in and they would beat the crap out of you. Sometimes, even when you paid the ransom, they would still beat the crap out of you just because they like to fight. So the Toltecs were kind of rough in that regard. And the Aztecs are going to borrow a lot of their tribute policies from the Toltecs themselves. The Toltec also had the legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The idea that the Toltec ruler isn't the actual ruler, it's Quetzalcoatl, and that someday he'll return in human form to reclaim his kingdom. This certainly played a role in the Cortez conquest, right, which we'll take a look at in World Civ 2. Basically, the capital of the Toltecs was at Tula, and they found some massive stone heads that were called Atlantes. So I want to talk a little bit about this and the Atlantes. First of all, the jaguar was sacred to the Toltecs, but we talked about how it was probably sacred all the way back to the Olmecs. Atlantean figures. So in the Toltec capital, there are these huge stone heads, these huge stone statues that are constructed that many believed when they first investigated them in like the 50s or 40s that they were evidence of Atlantis. That's where they get the Atlantean idea. If you're not familiar with Atlantis, I believe we talked about it a little bit with the Greeks, but probably not significantly. Basically, the philosopher Plato tells a story where he talks about how in a single day and night that the most advanced society on the world, the Atlanteans, were swallowed up by the sea and were destroyed and never existed again. This is very suspect, or as you guys would say, sus. Yes. It is in the respect that we just don't know enough about it. Honestly, it only appears in one transcript. It only appears in one writing. Plato did tend to get a little fanciful in his wording. He did talk about fictions, particularly in the Republic. So it's possible that this was just a conjuring of his imagination, or maybe he's talking about somebody like the Minoans, who were a real civilization that was swallowed up by the sea because of volcanic activity. But we don't know. That we just don't know. But the connection to the Toltecs is flimsy. So to say that the Atlanteans were wiped out and then they somehow managed to use their advanced technology to get to Mexico and then built these stone heads, I mean, because we never found Atlantis, we can't confirm that the heads are going to be the same. So to me, it's kind of a stretch. But certainly for those of you who believe in the Atlantis legend, right, you're certainly allowed to believe what you believe. But the Toltecs probably carved these, or they got other people to do it for them, which was what the Toltecs were really good at doing. Is they didn't want to do the bad work, and so they would let other people do it for them. And that was part of what they did as their tributary status. Again, the problem with having harsh tributes on all your people is that eventually your people are going to revolt, and they did. And the Toltecs eventually ended up getting ganged up on by all their other peoples that were their tributaries, and those people ended up largely taking them over. And so when that happened, that was the end, right? So any questions as far as the Toltecs are concerned? Any questions on Mesoamerican peoples? Again, we don't cover the Aztecs because the Aztecs are in World Civ 2. They're after 1300, right? But this is around the time the Aztecs start migrating in. They probably would have been tributaries of the Toltecs or the people that followed them, more than likely. And then the Aztecs kind of took a page out of the Toltecs playbook. They armed themselves and then they basically overthrew their overlords. But we talk about it in World Civ 2. So if you're interested in the Aztecs, they play a role. Why does Texas divided at 1300 CE? I don't know. That's a really good question. Texas has some interesting rules as far as how they divide their history courses. So I have no idea, but we can't really talk about a society that's after 1300 CE. It simply doesn't fit in with the rest of the course. Okay. Early Andean civilization. So we'll transition to South America, and we'll talk about a few cultures in South America and their significance. First of all, as far as South America, we're taking a look at the Andes Mountains, really along the western edge of South America. And the peoples that lived there, they caught fish. They basically grew squash and beans. They also grew potatoes, which are going to play a major role, obviously, in our society today. Certainly, potatoes are a big thing that we eat, from French fries to mashed potatoes to they're used in all kinds of things. Tomatoes probably were first domesticated in Mexico as well. So both of these are things that are going to play a major role in Western societies later on as part of what's called the Columbian Exchange. But as far as the Andeans, they didn't have large pack animals. So for the most part, they had to walk. And not only did they have to walk, they had to walk through the mountains. So many of the great empires later, like the Incas, are going to build, pretty decent road systems and bridges that connect the various municipalities together. The earliest structures that we have are around 2500 BCE, and these are pretty decent sized pyramids. Now, the people who built these were probably either the Chavan or the Nazca peoples, probably more than likely the Nazca. And they built good sized pyramids that would have rivaled the ones that you see in Egypt. Well, not as big, but certainly around the same time period this was going on. So evidence of aliens, right? Or the predator was there, probably. No, they just figured out that was the best way to do it. That was the most logical way to stack blocks. So by the 900s, they had pretty substantial populations. Now, the Nazca culture, they're going to take place around 100 BCE, and they're really in the area we know today as Peru. They had elaborate textiles. They built extravagant irrigation systems because they obviously lived in a dry area. And the thing that made them really famous is what are known as geoglyphs. So if you don't know what a geoglyph is, it is these, what are called Nazca lines, right, or a geoglyph. You can see, obviously, it looks like an animal. So what they would do is they would literally go out into the desert and they would basically chisel down to bedrock at each of these areas and remove all the soil that was in the way. And that's basically what you're seeing is you're just seeing the underlayer of bedrock. Now, how long would it take to do something like this? A long time. But some of you really like digging. So it would be, if you really like digging, this would be a great job for you. And they would do this in order to design, animals and other kinds of things. Now, again, you get the alien hypothesis because this can only be seen from the air. So obviously they had to have some kind of flying machine. Not necessarily. I mean, there's a lot of cultures that have burial mounds that are designed to look like specific animals. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to look at them. You could find a mountain, you could find a hill somewhere, right, and tell somebody if they're going wrong. I always think of the Geico commercial where it's the overseer is building a pyramid for the pharaoh, and it's supposed to be like in the shape of a box, and he ends up doing a pyramid. He's like, uh-oh. Bro, I mean, you'd have somebody who could oversee it to make sure it looks the way that's supposed to. So I don't necessarily think aliens are involved. But as far as the Nazca, they lived in one of the driest climates on Earth. And yet they were able to make a go of it because of their extensive irrigation networks. And that's what made them really their claim to fame. The pyramids were there for elaborate rituals of human sacrifice. The Nazca frequently would go even further. So they would do things like drinking the victim's blood and peeling the flesh from people's bones. They were pretty hardcore. So they were even, more bloodthirsty than the Mayans were. But by 700 CE, they're pretty much gone. and we don't know what happened to them. All that's left is really their beautiful goods, the grave goods that they've created, their fantastic jewelry that they construct. Um, just don't know. We know that they perform brain surgeries. They put plates in people's heads. Um, they were capable of making these large geoglyphs. Deforestation, famine, massive flooding, all possibilities. Obviously living in a dry desert climate, it's going to be tough going to begin with. Maybe something happened that dried up the irrigation canals and people, were forced to go elsewhere. We just don't know. But that basically brings about the end of what's known as Nazca civilization, and really South American civilization as well. The Incas are going to build largely on the Nazca foundations, and they're going to basically use a lot of Nazca ideas for their own empire, although they're going to make theirs on a much larger and grander scale. So pretty much covers most of Mesoamerican and Southern American societies. Does anybody have any questions on any of the groups that we took a look at today? Going once, going twice. Okay. So discussion questions. These are things you should be taking a look at. Why were small groups of Spaniards able to conquer larger groups of Mesoamericans? Compare and contrast two Mesoamerican societies that you feel are the most important. Why? And number three, how did Mayans set the precedent for all Mesoamerican societies that followed? So again, these are just questions to ask yourself as you're going through the readings. And if you can answer them, then you're right where you need to be at this stage in the game. If you don't understand it, or if you don't remember who the Nazca are, then there's no problem with rewinding the video and looking at it again, or basically going back through the PowerPoints, right? Or doing your own research, right? Which you're always free to do as well. This pretty much covers our lecture today. If you don't have any other questions, we'll basically call it a day for today. Big thanks to everybody, right, for turning up today. With our next lecture, as we go into next week, we'll be taking a look at our final two chapters, which will basically cover the Orient and the East, our societies like the Chinese in the medieval period, and obviously the Delhi Sultanate in India. And so we'll take a look at both of those, and that will largely close out the course as far as the lectures are concerned. No questions? Everybody good? All right, guys, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Take care. You too.